Okay, so we are going to break down these three objectives as our introduction to taxonomy. And the first thing we're going to look at are the verbs. So we have one verb here, which is define. Then we have recognize. And then down here we have, these are some new verbs, categorize, and then compare. So let's look at what those verbs mean within. So when we define something, we're basically saying, what is it? Okay? And when we recognize, and particularly when you look at here and it says recognize the importance, we've seen that before when we talked about meiosis. We're looking at why is it important? Okay, so those are pretty straightforward verbs. I will tell you this, when we're defining stuff, we're looking for not to make it overcomplicated. I'm just going to bring this down just a little bit so we have a little better. There we go. Okay, so what are we defining and what are we talking about? Why is it important? We are talking about a standardized taxonomic system. Okay, so I guess I need to tell you what taxonomy is. Well, taxonomy is nothing more complicated than putting things into groups based on them having features which are similar. And a standardized system is something that is the same everywhere. So standardized, anytime you're talking about a standardized system, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you're going to use the same kind of process, same set of standards, same set of rules. So it is the same everywhere. If you recall, we were talking about buzzards. And I told you, as we all think of, when we think of a buzzard here, we think of something that is a scavenger, the birds that eat roadkill on the side of the road. If you go to Europe, a buzzard is a raptor. It's a bird of prey. It hunts and kills its food, just like an eagle would. So there's a little bit confusion there because you're using the same name for two different things. Well, if you have a standardized system, right, it's the same everywhere, and so everybody uses the same name for every organism, and that gets rid of confusion. So why is it the same everywhere? To reduce confusion. And we use this thing called binomial nomenclature. I know that is a crazy term, right? But you do actually understand this because everybody has a first name, everybody has a second name. Your second name tells you which kind of family you belong to, and your first name identifies you specifically. So you have two, binomial means name. So you have two names, right? And nomenclature is just, it's like you have two names. That's what this term means. But when we do this, when we talk about two names, we're always saying, okay, so your first name, unlike, Karaka is my family name. Unlike my last name being my family name, when we name stuff in science, we use two names. That's the binomial bit. It's always in Latin. Why is it in Latin? Because when they came up with this idea, Latin was the language of the educated, and Latin was the predominant language that everybody understood. Obviously, not anymore. But we use two names. It's in Latin. The first is like your family name. and the second is your species. That is the individual. So, for example, Canis familiaris. Canis is the family name, okay? And this is a dog. Canis lupus. You see it has the same family name, but it has a different species name. This is a wolf. That tells me that dogs and wolves are very closely related. Okay, so that's the first one. So now let's look at the second one. Categorize, right? Categorize organisms in a hierarchical classification system. Okay, so when we categorize something, we are putting, right, something into groups. And it's a hierarchical system. But hierarchy is just basically starting with something big and getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So your biggest is at the top, and that will contain the most number of different species, and we call that a domain. Okay? And then all the living things are split into smaller groups called kingdoms. Okay? And then kingdoms are split into smaller groups called a phylum, or a phyla sometimes. That's its plural. Phyla are split into a lot of different groups called classes. Classes are split into orders. Orders are split into families. So you may have, like, for example, the cat family. Well, the cat family contains, not only does it contain Tigger that you've got at home, but it also contains lions and tigers, and it contains cheetahs and panthers and bobcats, and they're all different members of the same family, but we can split them down further into what are called genus. This is in fact your first name. So Canis is a genus, and then they are split into things called species. So if domains are the biggest group and have lots and lots and lots of different types of living things, and as you go down, they get smaller and smaller and smaller until you get to species, which is the smallest, and it literally represents one thing. So this is what we mean when we're talking about hierarchical orders for classification. You do need to know this order, right? You need to know that the domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And my mnemonic for that, that's my way of remembering this, and it's the way every single science teacher ever teaches it, is: did King Philip come over for great sex? I'll say that again. Did King Philip come over for great sex? Because you got to remember it. You hopefully will never forget that one. Okay, so now the last part here, and I should remind you that when you go from biggest to smallest, this is called a hierarchy, okay, which is just putting things in order, biggest to smallest. The last bit here is compare. What do we do when we compare? We are comparing characteristics of taxonomic groups, including these things. So we have to be able to say, look at a bunch of different species and say, which group do they go in? So we have to know the differences. between each group. Okay, and so we have to look at so we have to know the differences. And for example, we can split domains into what are called the prokaryote. What are the prokaryote? What does it sound like? Prokaryote. So we've got the group organisms that are prokaryotic cells, and there are two domains. There are the archaea, and back when I was in school, they were actually called archaeobacteria, and I like to do that just to remind you, because we know that if it's a bacteria, it is a prokaryote. And then there are the eubacteria, or just bacteria. So they belong to a group called the prokaryote. And then we have the eukaryote domain. What does that sound like? Organisms that are made up of eukaryotic cells. And there are a bunch, but basically we need to know about protists. We need to know about fungi. We need to know about plants and animals. And so we put things in groups. For example, how do they feed? Right? How do they get food? Are they, and while this may not be a common word for you, you do know what it means. Are they an autotroph? Auto means self. Do they make their own food? What do we know that makes its own food? Is it a plant, right? Or it is a heterotroph. Is it a consumer? Does it eat something else? So, for example, animals are heterotrophs. And I think I've spelled heterotroph. I think I've missed some words out there. Okay, in fact, okay, corrected my spelling mistake. And then, for example, what about classifying things based on cells? So are they unicellular? Okay, is the whole organism one cell, or are they multicellular? Like, for example, all plants are multicellular, all animals are multicellular, whereas some of these things up here are unicellular. Protists can be unicellular. So we're going to look at all the different features and decide, based on various features, which kingdoms, phyla, and these go into. So that's a brief introduction to classification, and we are going to be getting done pretty quickly through this.